She moved quietly through the cafe, her steps soft against the worn wooden floor. The morning rush had already passed, leaving behind the faint smell of coffee and the soft clatter of dishes being stacked. She carried a tray with careful hands, balancing cups of steaming drinks with a precision that made the work seem effortless. Even though she had been running herself almost ragged all morning, no one really noticed her. Not really. Customers smiled at the barista behind the counter, chatted with the manager, or waved at familiar faces, but she moved like a shadow, blending into the background. That was her way. She had learned early that being noticed rarely brought anything good, so she kept herself small, polite, and nearly invisible, even as she placed the drinks on a table. Adjusting the sugar packets just so, she felt a quiet satisfaction. There was pride in doing a task well, even if no one commented, but the truth was, she wanted more than to serve coffee and clear tables. Deep inside, there was a spark of something bigger, something that had been growing quietly for years. Yet, in this room filled with chatter, laughter, and the faint hum of a radio in the corner, her talents remained hidden. She was a silent worker, known for efficiency and calm, but not for anything remarkable. At least, not yet. The cafe was small, a cozy place with mismatched chairs and tables that had seen better days. Paint peeled slightly from the walls near the entrance, and the smell of old wood mixed with the aroma of fresh coffee beans. For many customers, this was part of the charm. For her, it was simply another stage for her daily routine. She liked the quiet corners and the occasional friendly smile from a regular, but she had long stopped expecting anyone to truly notice her. Her life had taught her that the world rarely paused for people who moved softly, who spoke quietly, who kept their hands busy and their heads down behind her polite smile. She carried memories that weighed more than she let on. Life had never been easy. She grew up in a home where silence was often louder than words, where accomplishments went unnoticed, and where mistakes seemed magnified. She learned early to observe, to absorb, and to find small moments of joy in places where no one would see. A cup of tea on a rainy afternoon, the sound of rain tapping against the window, a melody that lingered in her head long after a song finished, these small things became her secret companions. And slowly, over years, those companions shaped her into someone quietly skilled, someone who could take ordinary moments and turn them into something meaningful. If only she had the chance. Her hands were strong and precise, conditioned by years of practice and silence. No one in the cafe knew the hours she spent honing her craft. To the customers, they were just the hands of a server who moved deftly, carrying trays, wiping tables, and refilling drinks. But those same hands could do far more. They could dance over a keyboard, bring music to life, create rhythm from stillness. It was a skill that had been nurtured in stolen moments, late nights, and mornings before anyone else stirred. She had learned to hide it not out of shame, but because the world often dismissed quiet talent, and she had long accepted that being unseen was safer than being ridiculed. Still, there was a longing inside her that could not be quieted. She noticed the way some people watched performers, musicians, or artists, their eyes lighting up in awe. She imagined what it would feel like to have that kind of recognition, to have the room stop and truly see her. Not just as a server, but as someone who could move hearts without words. The thought was intoxicating, almost forbidden in its intensity. She tucked it away, knowing the cafe was her stage for now, even if the audience wasn't ready to notice her just yet that morning. As she poured a cup of coffee for a customer sitting by the window, she caught herself watching their fingers tap lightly on the table, absent-mindedly. There was a rhythm to it, a kind of music that was easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. She smiled faintly, almost to herself, thinking about how the simplest gestures could hold so much potential. Her mind wandered briefly to a piano she had played years ago, the feel of the keys under her fingers, the way each note could carry emotion without a single word. It was a distant memory, yet it lingered with warmth and longing. She had put that part of herself aside, just for now, believing that one day the right moment would arrive. As the morning unfolded, she moved from table to table, responding to orders with soft words and steady hands. Regulars greeted her with nods or a brief smile, but she remained quiet, returning polite replies without drawing attention to herself. Some coworkers chatted loudly in the corner, their laughter echoing across the room. While she moved through the space like water around rocks, present but not intrusive, flowing with a calm determination, she had mastered the art of being useful without being noticed, a skill that had served her well in countless places before this cafe. Yet deep down, she hoped for something more. Though she didn't know exactly what form it would take, during a lull in the afternoon, she took a moment to wipe down a table by the window. Sunlight streamed through the glass, casting long shadows on the floor and highlighting the faint dust motes in the air. For a brief instant, she allowed herself to breathe and imagine another life, one where her hands were admired not just for serving coffee, but for creating, something that made people stop and feel. She closed her eyes for a second, picturing herself playing in a small hall, an audience hushed and attentive, every note resonating with emotion. The vision was so vivid that for a moment it felt almost real. She opened her eyes, letting the day's routine pull her back. But the spark lingered, quietly urging her forward. The cafe door jingled as a group of students entered, laughing and jostling each other. She approached them with the same calm demeanor, taking their orders and setting the drinks down with care. They barely looked at her, absorbed in their own world. She could feel the invisible wall that often separated her from people who didn't expect anything from her. And yet, she didn't resent them. She had learned that resentment only wasted energy that could be better used elsewhere. Instead, she focused on the small victories: no spilled drinks, clean tables, satisfied customers. Every day she walked away with proof that her quiet efforts mattered, even if no one else acknowledged them. When the last customer left and the cafe grew quiet, she allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She stacked chairs, wiped counters, and cleaned surfaces with the precision of someone who found solace in order. In the stillness, she imagined what it would be like if her life took a different turn. What if someone recognized the skill, the precision, the dedication hidden in her hands? What if she were no longer invisible? If the quiet work she did every day became the first step toward something greater? The thought sent a shiver through her, not of fear, but of anticipation, like the first note of a song that had yet to be played. That evening, she left the cafe as quietly as she had arrived. Walking through streets that smelled of rain and warm food, the city was alive with noise, but she moved through it with a sense of purpose, her hands lightly brushing against her bag. She thought about the music she had loved in secret, about the rhythms and melodies she had carried in her mind through years of work and quiet struggle. It was a part of her that could not be hidden forever. She didn't know when the moment would come, but she knew that it would. And when it did, she would be ready. Even now. As she walked home under the dim streetlights, there was a small smile on her lips. Not a smile for anyone else, but a private one, meant only for herself. She had learned to survive in silence, to move through life unnoticed, and to find satisfaction in quiet competence. Yet the spark inside her was restless. It wanted more than a life of shadows. It wanted recognition, yes, but more than that, it wanted to speak without words, to leave an impression that could not be ignored. She had carried this dream through countless days of quiet work, and she would carry it still until the day it could finally be realized. And so, she returned home, her hands tired from hours of service, but her mind alive with possibility. She sat at a small table in the corner of her modest apartment, a cup of tea steaming beside her. Her fingers traced patterns on the wood absent-mindedly, a habit from years of practice and thought. She allowed herself to imagine what could be, to picture the moment when her quiet dedication would bloom into something the world could no longer overlook. It was a small hope, fragile but persistent. And for the first time that day, she let herself believe that her silent work, her patience, and her hidden talent might one day be enough to change everything. After the cafe closed that night, she returned to her small apartment, a place that was modest but full of memories and quiet comforts. The space was simple, bare walls with a few pictures taped unevenly. A small table, a worn chair, and a tiny shelf holding books that had been read and reread over the years. To anyone else, it might have seemed empty or unremarkable, but to her, it was a sanctuary. Here she could breathe, think, and let her mind wander freely. Most importantly, here she could practice the things she loved most without interruption. Her music. She carried her bag to the table and set it down, careful not to disturb the faint hum of the night outside. Her fingers itched slightly, not from work, but from longing. Even after a long day of standing, serving, and moving, she felt the pull to touch the keys, to make them sing in ways no one around her could hear. The piano in the corner of her small living room was old, its keys slightly yellow and its sound imperfect, but it was hers. It had been a gift from someone who believed in her when she was very young, and it had been her companion through every struggle, every small triumph, and every quiet night spent alone. She sat on the bench, her hands hovering over the keys for a moment. There was something sacred about this pause. A moment between the chaos of daily life and the private world of music she had created for herself. Her fingers descended slowly, playing scales, simple exercises at first, letting her muscles wake up. She had learned that patience was key. Even when no one was watching, every note mattered. Every movement of her fingers, every breath she took while playing, was part of a process that had been honed over years. Life had taught her resilience early. She had grown up in a household where voices were often raised, but not in a way that nurtured. Compliments were rare and mistakes were magnified. She learned to hide her talents, to remain silent, to find comfort in small victories. Even as a child, she had spent hours on that same piano, teaching herself songs she could barely read, learning to feel the music rather than just play it. Her parents had discouraged her, insisting that practical work was more important, that dreams were a luxury she couldn't afford, but she had persisted quietly, carrying the piano's music like a secret treasure, a place where the world couldn't touch her. As she moved her fingers across the keys, she allowed herself to remember the early days, nights when she played by candlelight because the electricity had been cut, or mornings when she woke before anyone else to practice a song she had just learned. Those were lonely times, but they had shaped her into someone who could work quietly, persistently, and without complaint. She had learned to make herself useful in the world, even if it didn't notice her talent. Yet, in the shadows of her apartment, she could finally be herself, fully and without compromise. The music flowed through her, soft at first, building gradually into something more complex and emotive. She didn't play for an audience, yet each note carried intention. She imagined stories in the melodies, characters, and moments that might never exist outside her mind. The piano was not just an instrument. It was a voice, a way to express everything she had learned to keep silent in daily life. Here, she could release frustration, joy, sadness, and hope in a language that no one could misinterpret. Even with all her skill, she faced constant doubt. Some days, after long hours at the cafe and long nights at the piano, she wondered if it was enough. Would anyone ever hear her music? Would anyone care? The world outside often seemed too loud, too busy, and too dismissive to notice someone who moved quietly. There were moments when she questioned whether she should continue at all, whether it was wiser to remain invisible, blending into the background where no one could hurt her dreams. Yet each time, she returned to the piano. Because it was more than a dream, it was a part of her, as necessary as breathing. Her financial struggles added weight to her daily life. She had to pay rent, buy food, cover bills, and manage small emergencies that came up without warning. Each shift at the cafe felt like a battle against time, a fight to keep her life afloat while still nurturing the small fire inside her. She had friends who occasionally asked her to go out, to enjoy life more, but she often declined. Nights were precious. They were for practice, for dreaming, for honing her skills until they could no longer remain hidden. It was a lonely life, yes, but it was purposeful. Every choice, every sacrifice, was an investment in the hope that someday someone would notice what she could do. Her persistence was almost invisible, but it was relentless. Hours turned into days, days into weeks, and weeks into years. She played hundreds of songs, improvising melodies, learning new techniques, and sometimes even composing her own pieces. Every day brought small improvements, subtle shifts that only she could measure. Her fingers became nimble and expressive, her ears sharp. her memory sharp enough to recall the smallest detail of a song after hearing it once. Yet, the world outside continued on as if she were invisible. At the cafe, she remained a quiet presence, unnoticed by the very people who might have admired her talent if they knew. Despite the hardships, there were small moments of joy. Occasionally, she would play a song she had perfected and feel a rush of pride that no one could take away. Sometimes, a neighbor might pause outside her window and smile at the sound. Or a stray melody would drift into the night and find its way into the city streets, unnoticed but alive. These small moments mattered more than praise or recognition. They reminded her that her work had meaning, even when it was unseen. She also had her routines, habits that grounded her in the midst of struggle. Every morning before work, she would warm up her fingers with scales, stretching them carefully to avoid tension. Every night after work, she would practice for at least an hour, sometimes longer if fatigue allowed. Meals were simple and often rushed, but she made time for tea, a quiet companion that helped her reflect on the day. She kept journals filled with thoughts, melodies, and small observations about life, capturing the details that might otherwise be forgotten. These routines were her lifeline, the structure that kept her dreams alive despite the constant pull of reality. Her mind often wandered as she played. She thought about the future, imagining small stages, soft lights, and attentive listeners. She pictured herself performing pieces she had only played in her apartment, feeling the music flow into the hearts of others, leaving them breathless, moved, and silent in awe. The fantasy was vivid, and though she rarely shared it with anyone, it gave her a quiet strength to keep going. She reminded herself that talent alone was not enough. It had to be paired with perseverance, patience, and preparation. And she had all three in abundance. At times, she reflected on the people who had doubted her. Teachers who said she wouldn't succeed, peers who ignored her efforts, even family members who never understood the passion that burned inside her. She didn't resent them. Instead, she allowed their doubt to fuel her determination. Each discouraging word became another reason to practice, to improve, and to prove, not to them necessarily, but to herself, that she was capable of extraordinary things. She carried that quiet resolve with her everywhere, in every shift at the cafe, in every practice session, in every sleepless night. Her apartment grew quiet as the night deepened. She played until her fingers tingled and her eyes grew heavy, yet she felt a deep satisfaction. The music she created in solitude was honest, raw, and unfiltered. It was her voice, her escape, her purpose. And though the world outside remained unaware, she knew that the hours spent practicing, imagining, and persevering were building toward something that could not be denied forever. When she finally rose from the piano, her fingers aching slightly, she took a moment to stretch, letting her mind drift over the day's events. Tomorrow would be another day of work at the cafe, another day of moving quietly through life, unnoticed and underestimated. But she felt ready. She carried with her the knowledge that her preparation, her talent, and her resilience were steadily accumulating. One day, she believed the world would see what she had to offer. And when that day came, the years of struggle, silence, hidden effort would finally make sense. She blew out the small lamp beside the piano, plunging the room into darkness. Outside, the city lights twinkled faintly, a reminder that the world moved on with or without her. Inside, she felt a quiet sense of peace, knowing that she had nurtured her gift in secret, shaping it like a seed, waiting for the right season to bloom. She lay down to sleep, exhausted yet alive with anticipation. She did not know when opportunity would arrive, or who would recognize her, but she knew she would be ready. Her music, her perseverance, and her courage had grown in silence, and silence, she believed, could be just as powerful as any applause. And so, even as the night wore on, she dreamed not just of recognition, but of a life where she could finally step out of the shadows and show the world what her hands, her mind, and her heart were capable of. Every note she had played, every long hour of practice, every quiet sacrifice had prepared her for the moment when she would no longer be invisible. And though that moment had not yet arrived, she held on to hope, steady and unshakable, knowing that patience, persistence, and passion had a way of shaping destiny in ways no one could predict. The morning began like any other, with the soft clatter of dishes and the hiss of coffee machines filling the cafe. She moved through the room with the same quiet efficiency, carrying cups of coffee, clearing plates, and answering polite questions with a calm voice. Customers came and went, some familiar, some new, but none of them noticed her beyond the work she performed. That had been the pattern for years. She had become invisible, a part of the furniture in the cafe, doing her tasks with care but without expectation of recognition. Yet, Stay felt different, though she couldn't say why. Perhaps it was the way the sunlight streamed through the windows, casting golden patterns on the tables. Perhaps it was the faint chill in the air that made her fingers flex instinctively, ready for something gunk now. She moved from table to table, pouring coffee with precision, wiping spills before anyone noticed, and keeping her eyes observant, as she always did. She was used to noticing small details, how a customer's hand trembled slightly when reaching for a cup, the slight tension in a coworker's shoulders, the rhythm of the cafe's pulse. She was part of the pattern, yet apart from it, quietly aware of everything that passed. Mid-morning, a small commotion began near the entrance. A group of people entered the cafe, their voices louder than usual, carrying a sense of urgency. She observed them from a distance, wiping a table and adjusting a sugar packet. Something about their presence felt different, more focused than the usual chatter of customers. They were looking around, scanning the room as if searching for someone or something. She stayed calm, moving closer only when they approached her, politely asking if there was space for a small performance. Her heart skipped a beat, though she didn't show it. A performance? In her cafe? She had never expected anything like this. The group explained that a local music showcase had been organized, and they were seeking someone to play immediately. They needed a volunteer, someone talented. The manager of the cafe had suggested her without telling anyone she could play. She froze for a moment, unsure whether to say yes or hide. This was the opportunity she had quietly dreamed about for years. Yet the thought of stepping into the spotlight made her chest tighten. The customers stopped to watch, curious about the sudden turn of events. Conversations paused and eyes turned toward her. She felt the weight of attention in a way she had rarely experienced. Her hands, usually steady, felt slightly shaky, and she took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. She had prepared for moments like this in her mind countless times. She had imagined playing in small halls, on stages, in quiet rooms, and today, in the most unexpected way. That imaginary scenario was materializing slowly. She moved toward the small corner set up with a keyboard and a microphone. The group offered a polite nod, encouraging her. She glanced around, noting the faces of strangers who would judge her in seconds, and then she closed her eyes for a moment. She let her fingers touch the keys lightly, feeling their texture, remembering the countless hours of practice. This was her life, her skill, her voice. She would not let fear stop her now. The first note sounded soft and deliberate. The room quieted immediately, as if it were waiting for her to continue. She had not played for anyone outside her apartment in years, yet her hands moved with precision, recalling every melody, every rhythm, every technique she had refined in private. The sound filled the cafe, delicate at first, then richer and deeper as she gained confidence. Customers leaned forward in surprise, noticing the sudden shift from ordinary cafe ambiance to something extraordinary. Her fingers danced across the keys, each movement confident yet full of emotion. She played from her heart, letting every note carry a story, a feeling she had kept inside for years. There was frustration, longing, and resilience in the melody, but also hope. People stopped what they were doing, their conversations hushed, and the group that had brought the keyboard watched in awe. Even the manager, who had known her for years, seemed stunned by the transformation in front of them. She was no longer the quiet server in the corner. She had become something entirely different. Someone commanding attention without a word. Someone whose talent could not be ignored. The music moved through the room like a wave, shifting from soft, introspective passages to bold, flowing sequences that demanded attention. Her hands moved as if guided by instinct, responding to emotions she hadn't fully named, creating a harmony between skill and feeling that only years of dedication could produce. Customers exchanged glances, whispering softly, some shaking their heads in disbelief. How had they never noticed this talent before? She had been among them every day, working quietly. Yet none of them had imagined this depth of ability hidden behind her calm exterior as the performance continued. A few people pulled out their phones, capturing the moment. Not wanting to forget the unexpected display of skill, she didn't play for attention. She played because the music demanded it, because every note was a release of years spent in preparation and quiet determination. Every sound that left the keyboard carried with it a story of patience, struggle, and unwavering persistence. She let the melody build, crescendoing in a way that made the room vibrate with energy, then softened, drawing listeners in with tender, intimate passages. Each transition was natural, effortless, yet the result was mesmerizing. Her mind was fully present, aware of every nuance, every breath of the audience, every subtle shift in expression. Some faces reflected surprise, others admiration, and a few showed disbelief. They could not have imagined that the quiet, polite server who had brought them coffee each morning was capable of producing something so moving, so alive. The music became a language in itself, bypassing words, opinions, and expectations. It spoke directly to the heart, leaving the listeners unable to respond immediately. By the time she reached the final sequence, the room was completely silent. Not a single conversation, not a cough, not even the soft clink of a spoon on a saucer could be heard. All attention was focused on her fingers moving across the keys, on the melody that had grown from soft whispers to bold declarations. She played each note with purpose, drawing every ounce of emotion into the performance. She could feel the energy in the room, not as pressure, but as connection. Every listener was present with her, experiencing the story she had carried silently for years. As the last note faded, she allowed her hands to linger lightly on the keys, then rested them on her lap. The room was still silent for a heartbeat, suspended in disbelief. Then slowly claps began, soft at first, then growing louder as the audience realized what they had witnessed. Customers who had ignored her for years now looked at her with new eyes, some standing to applaud, others wiping away a tear or smiling in wonder. Even the group that had brought the keyboard looked astonished. Having anticipated talent, but not this level of mastery, she didn't smile immediately. She simply bowed her head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement, not of pride. In that moment, she felt a surge of calm satisfaction. Years of quiet work, invisible practice, and personal struggle had led to this instant. The applause was gratifying, but the real reward was deeper. It was the realization that her dedication, patience, and resilience had finally found a voice in the world. She had stepped into the light not with arrogance, but with authenticity. Allowing the music to speak for her, customers continued to applaud, some approaching to offer words of admiration. She nodded politely, still reserved, still quiet. But there was a new strength in her posture, a subtle confidence that had not been there before. The manager, usually composed and slightly distant, looked at her with a mixture of pride and astonishment. Realizing how much potential had been hidden in the quiet worker they had underestimated for so long, as the room settled, people returned to their seats, but the energy lingered. Conversations resumed, but now there was an air of respect, a recognition that something remarkable had occurred. She moved quietly to clear the remaining dishes, her hands steady, her heart full, aware that her life had shifted in a subtle but profound way. She had crossed a line from invisibility to acknowledgement, not through words, but through the undeniable power of her talent. After the cafe quieted down again, she lingered for a moment by the piano. Her fingers hovered over the keys, remembering each note, each emotion she had poured into the performance. She realized that this was only the beginning. The experience had ignited something inside her, a recognition that opportunity often arrives in unexpected forms, and that courage, even when paired with fear, could create moments that changed everything. She returned to her duties with renewed focus, but the energy from the performance stayed with her. She noticed details in a new way: the way sunlight reflected off a coffee cup, small gestures of gratitude from customers, the subtle rhythm of the cafe's heartbeat. Everything seemed sharper, more vivid, more alive. She understood, finally, that visibility was not always about being loud or outspoken. Sometimes it was about timing, preparation, and letting the right moment reveal your worth. As the day ended and she prepared to leave, she glanced back at the piano in the corner. It had been her secret for years, her silent companion. And now it had become the bridge between her hidden world and the world outside. She knew that the next steps were uncertain, that the journey ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in a long while, she felt ready. She had faced the unexpected, embraced it, and transformed it into something meaningful. Walking home under the dim city lights, she allowed herself to smile quietly. She had stepped beyond the boundaries of her ordinary life. And though the applause had faded, the feeling of accomplishment remained. Her hands, once only instruments of service, had become instruments of expression, proof of her talent and perseverance. The memory of the performance lingered, not as a fleeting moment, but as a turning point. Something had shifted in her, in the people who witnessed her, and in the quiet confidence that would guide her in the days to come. She arrived at her apartment and sat at her piano, the room silent but full of possibility. Her fingers hovered over the keys, not to play but to remember. Today had been proof that years of silent work, private dedication, and persistent hope could lead to extraordinary moments. And though the future remained uncertain, she knew that she was no longer invisible, no longer confined to the background. She had touched the hearts of those who had doubted her existence. And in doing so, she had discovered a power that could never be taken away. The cafe had never felt so alive. Even after the applause had quieted, the air remained thick with anticipation, as if the room itself was holding its breath. She stood near the piano, her hands still tingling from the performance, feeling a strange mixture of relief and nervous energy. Though the first notes had been played, and the audience had seen her skill, she sensed that the true moment, the moment that would leave everyone truly speechless, was only just beginning. Customers lingered, unable or unwilling to leave. Some sat frozen, staring at the piano, their drinks untouched. Others whispered to each other, faces lit with disbelief, as if trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Her quiet demeanor had not changed, but there was a subtle shift in her posture, firmness in her shoulders, a calm determination in her eyes. She knew the performance had moved people, but now it was time to let the music speak even louder. To fill every corner of the room and make the experience unforgettable, she leaned forward slightly, placing her fingers on the keys, and began again. This time the melody was different. It was not just skill being displayed, it was emotion, raw and unfiltered. She allowed herself to feel everything she had held back for years: frustration, longing, hope, and joy. Each note carried weight, each movement of her fingers told a story. The soft, delicate passages contrasted sharply with sudden bursts of rhythm, creating a tension that gripped the listeners. Even those who thought they had understood her talent now realized they had only seen the surface. The cafe, usually filled with ordinary sounds, the clinking of cups, the hum of conversation, was transformed. The music had taken over completely. People leaned forward instinctively, as if drawn by invisible strings, their eyes fixed on the piano and the quiet woman whose fingers had become instruments of power. Her hands moved with fluid precision, each note measured yet bursting with life. She had always played for herself, but now she realized that music could connect, could reach hearts, could leave people breathless. If one dared to let it, some of the customers began to murmur softly among themselves, unable to contain their astonishment. "I had no idea she could play like this," one whispered, eyes wide. Another shook their heads slowly, as if to convince themselves that this was real. The group who had brought the keyboard looked on in astonishment, their earlier expectations dwarfed by what they were seeing. She had taken what they thought would be a simple performance and turned it into an experience that no one would forget. As the music swelled, she allowed herself to lose track of the world around her. Every thought of doubt, fear, or hesitation was replaced by focus. Her fingers flew over the keys, moving with a confidence born from years of silent dedication. She remembered every hour spent alone, every night when no one else could witness her progress, and every sacrifice she had made to nurture this talent. All of it coalesced in this moment, transforming her quiet skill into a powerful presence that demanded attention without a single word. The audience was completely captivated. Some held their hands over their mouths, unable to speak, afraid to break the spell. Others closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them, transporting them from the small cafe to a place of emotion and intensity that they could not describe. Even the manager, usually so composed, seemed taken aback, watching with a mixture of pride and amazement. He had known her as a quiet, polite worker, but he now realized he had underestimated the depth of her talent entirely. She moved seamlessly from one section of the piece to another, blending soft, intimate melodies with powerful, commanding sequences. Each transition was natural, yet it carried weight, tension, and release that gripped the audience. Her ability to convey feeling through every note was extraordinary. People who had come in expecting a simple display of skill found themselves caught in a story, as a narrative unfolding in sound, each moment more intense than the last. It was as if the piano itself had become a vessel for every emotion she had ever carried, and the room had become part of that vessel, vibrating with the resonance of her music. Her breathing was steady, controlled, as if she had entered a state where the world outside no longer mattered. The room had vanished. There was only the piano, the music, and the shared connection with those who listened. It was a moment of pure honesty, a revelation of what could happen when hidden talent met opportunity and courage, and the audience felt it. They could not ignore the power, the emotion, the dedication that flowed from her fingers. Each note was more than a sound, it was proof of years of perseverance and silent struggle. At one point, the music grew so soft, so intimate, that the audience leaned in instinctively. It was a delicate passage, almost fragile, yet brimming with vulnerability. She allowed herself to convey a story of quiet longing, of struggles carried in silence, of dreams nurtured alone. Every listener felt it differently, yet no one left unmoved. The room seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting for what would come next, knowing that this performance was extraordinary, something they would remember forever. Then, without warning, she shifted the tempo, and the music erupted into a sequence of bold, rapid notes, each striking with precision and energy. The contrast was breathtaking. Listeners gasped softly, some eyes widening in disbelief, as she demonstrated both technical skill and emotional depth. She had not only captured attention, she had commanded it, reshaping the entire atmosphere of the cafe in a matter of moments. People who had dismissed her presence for years now understood that she was capable of something truly remarkable. As the crescendo reached its peak, she felt a rush of exhilaration. She had never experienced anything quite like it. Her fingers moved instinctively, guided by years of practice, intuition, and an understanding of how music could convey emotion. She realized that this performance was no longer just about her, it was about the people listening, about the connection she could create through sound. Every note, every pause, every flourish was intentional, meant to draw them in and leave them breathless. The room remained silent in awe, even as the music began to wind down. She played the final notes with deliberate care, letting them resonate and fade naturally. The silence that followed was not awkward, it was reverent. The audience needed a moment to process, to acknowledge that what they had just witnessed was far beyond anything they had expected. She rested her hands lightly on the keys, a subtle smile crossing her face. She had done it. She had transformed the ordinary into the extraordinary. And in doing so, she had left everyone completely speechless. Then came the applause. It started slowly, tentative at first, but quickly grew in intensity. People stood, clapping, cheering, and even some wiping tears from their eyes. The group that had organized the showcase could hardly believe what they had seen. Regular customers, co-workers, and even strangers were united in admiration. their respect for her talent immediate and profound. The quiet server they had overlooked for years had become the center of attention, not through words or flamboyance, but through undeniable skill, emotion, and authenticity. She didn't speak immediately. She simply acknowledged the applause with a small nod, letting the music and the moment speak for themselves. There was a quiet pride in her posture, a subtle strength that had not been there before. She had always known the value of hard work, patience, and dedication, but now she saw how those qualities could transform a life. For the first time, the world outside her apartment walls had witnessed the result of years spent in silence. Honing a craft that many had ignored or underestimated, customers approached her cautiously, offering words of admiration and gratitude. "I didn't know you could play like that," one said, eyes wide. Another whispered, "That was incredible. I've never heard anything like it." She nodded politely, feeling warmth in her chest, but remained composed. She had always been modest, letting her work speak for her, and she did not need praise to validate what she had achieved. The validation had already come from within. In the countless hours she had spent perfecting her craft, and the dedication that had brought her to this moment, the manager came over. His usual stern expression softened into a smile. "I had no idea," he said quietly, shaking his head. "You've been hiding this talent for too long?" She smiled faintly, acknowledging the compliment without arrogance. She knew that recognition was fleeting, but the impact of her performance was lasting. She had left an impression that would not be forgotten, a moment that would be recounted among the customers and organizers for years to come. As the room settled, the audience lingered, hesitant to leave. People continued to whisper among themselves, replaying moments of the performance in their minds. They spoke of her precision, her emotion, and the unexpected depth of her talent. She moved quiet Lido, cleared the remaining dishes, but there was a new